applied to the database. So if we were to open up this SQLite3 file, we would see a table called lead, and we would see all of these columns created in it as well. So what I've done is I've installed an extension, which if we just go Command K, Command X, and then search for SQLite, you can see there SQLite, which is this extension. And basically what it allows you to do is inspect your SQLite databases. So you can go Command Shift P and then search SQLite, and you'll see there's all these different queries that or commands you can run. And what we want to do is we want to firstly open the database, which is this db.sqlite3 file. And if you do that, and we just open up the Explorer, then you can see here under SQLite Explorer that you have a database which is db.sqlite3, and we have all the tables that have been created in this database. Most of these were initially from Django when we ran the initial migrate command, but this last one here, leads_lead, is the one that we just created. And you can see here that there's the 4 fields we talked about. So ID, which is a primary key, first name and last name being character fields that have a maximum length of 20 characters, and age being an integer. So there is the actual table in the database, and the naming convention might be a little bit weird. Leads_lead. Basically, that's the name of the app, so leads, and then the name of the model, which is lead. So if you created another model in this file, you would have leads_, and then the name of that model. So far, we've only talked about these 2 fields, the character field and the integer field, but there are a lot more fields that we can go through. So the first one that I'm going to show you here is the Boolean field. And let's say that we wanted to store on our lead whether they have been phoned or not. So every lead that we get in touch with, we want to record whether or not we've actually got in touch with them. So we'll just set a Boolean field called phoned, and this is going to be models.boolean field. And we're going to set the default to be false, so that when this lead is created, phoned will automatically be set to false. Now a Boolean field is storing a Boolean value, so you can only give it true or false. Those are the only options that this database column can take. Then we might want to store the place that the lead came from. So the source of the lead. Was that Google, YouTube? Was it our newsletter? Whatever the source of it was. So how did they find us? So let's say that this is the source, and we can make this a character field. And what we can do is we can set the choices of the character field to be a tuple of options. Now a nice way of doing this is just by cutting this out, and right at the top what we can do is say the source choices and make that a tuple there instead, and set that inside here as the choices. Now we still need to give this a maximum length, so I'm going to say maximum length is, let's say 100 just to be safe. And inside this tuple we give options that can be selected as the source. So maybe we have here YouTube, and you'll see that the way that I'm doing this is I'm going YouTube, YouTube, and the way that this works is the first value is the value that gets stored in the database. So this could be, for example, YT, just to make it shorter and take up less space, and the display value would be YouTube. Now, just so that it looks the same and we don't have to worry about that, I'm going to keep it as the full name, YouTube, and I'm going to add another one here, which might be Google, and we'll add Google, and we'll add newsletter. All right, so newsletter there as well. So these are now the choices that can be selected when we create a lead model. It's important just to understand though that these choices don't actually restrict the value that goes into the database. So this is more of a Python restriction, and that if we were to work with forms, that Django would by default give us these choices, but we can actually override the value stored in there. So that's just something to be taken into consideration. We might want to give this lead a profile picture. So we could say profile picture is an image field. All right, so image field, And we can also specify things like blank equal true and null equal true. And basically what this means, blank means that you are submitting an empty string, whereas null means that there's actually no value in the database. So they are different, but basically what it means is that we can save this lead without there being a profile picture. So it's like making it optional, but do understand that these two things are different. So we can give an image field. We could say any special files that need to be added for this lead, and we can add a file field. Right? So a file field is like you would see if you were selecting a file in a form, then it lets you pick the file from your computer. It's exactly that. So you can store a file in this field, and that file, although it wouldn't be uploaded to the database, this would just be a reference to the actual file that gets saved in your project. And we'll talk more about files and images later, but just so you know that there is the option to specify images and files. So you can put blank and null there as well. And after this, we then have some more complicated fields, which are more to do with the relationships between tables. So these fields are more like information for the actual table itself, but none of these let you create relationships between tables. And that's where the foreign key field comes in. Now, I'm not going to make any of these changes permanent, as I'm just giving you the background theory as to what fields exist in Django and what you can actually achieve. But if we did want to make these changes part of our database schema, then we would need to go and run the manage.py make migrations command and the migrate command as well. But again, we're not going to be doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these fields that we talked about, and I'm going to introduce the foreign key field and talk about relationships between models. Now, just as there is in SQL and in database terminology, there's the concept of a foreign key. And basically what that does is it lets you link a table to another table. So you're creating a relationship. So for example, if there were a table of leads, maybe there's a table of sales agents. So we could have class, let's just say it agent, and it's going to be models.model. And this agent is going to be someone that's part of our team. So we'll just give them a first name and last name as well, just for the sake of having their personal information. And we would then want to assign the lead to an agent. So this agent would be responsible for getting in touch with the lead, calling them or cold emailing them, and basically talking to them about the service and offering the service. And essentially what we're doing is just allowing the agent to manage this lead. So if we had thousands of leads and we had, let's say, 20 or 30 agents, we would need to associate each lead to a particular agent. Now, the way that we do that, the way that we say that this lead belongs to this agent is by creating a relationship between these two tables. And we're going to use the foreign key to do that. So we're going to say that the agent for this lead is a foreign key to, now, if I were to move this class above here and put it first, then that would allow me to type agent like that. Otherwise, the class would not have been defined yet, because if I move it here, then even though it's getting picked up, this class is actually not defined. So if I just save this and run manage.py run server, then we can see we get an error here. Name agent is not defined. So what I'm doing is I'm moving it above here, but I do want to make it clear that this is not necessary. You don't need to move it above here. What you can do is you can just put the class in quotation marks like that. And what that's going to do is tell Django that agent is inside this file. So if I go and take agent and put him back down here and I save, and we see here that we get another error, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, but that previous error just went away. So this class, even though it's below, it's being looked up to be within the same file. Now you can see here that it says init missing one required positional argument, which is called onDelete. And that is for foreign keys. So foreign keys always need to be passed the onDelete positional argument or argument. And basically what this onDelete does is it tells Django how to handle when the related table row or instance is deleted. So what happens if we create a lead and we assign the agent, and then 2 months later we don't want this agent on the database anymore? Well, then who's the agent for this lead? What happens in that situation? And so there's a couple ways that we can handle that. So we can specify first it equals to models dot, and there's a few options. So first one is going to be dot cascade. So if you set it to dot cascade, what that means is if the agent is deleted, then we are going to delete this lead. That's what happens. So cascade means it's a knock-on effect. It's going to cascade the deletion and delete both of these. There's also another option here, which is the set null, right? So if you say set null, then that means we're going to set the value of the foreign key to be null. But this only works if we allow null to be true. Otherwise, we aren't allowing this foreign key to actually be set to null. And then there's also another option here, which is set default. And that would only help us if we had a default value here. So if we actually went and specified default equals to some value, then it would set the default value if the agent was deleted. But in our case, we're going to keep it simple and just let it cascade. So if the agent is deleted, then the lead is going to be deleted as well. All this means is that when we delete an agent, we need to be more mindful of that. We need to take into consideration that, hey, what's going to happen to the lead if we delete this agent? We're going to need to reassign all of the leads that are with this agent to a new agent if that's the case. And so that is the foreign key field. It's allowing us to create a relationship between the lead and the agent. And just one more thing is why this is being placed on the lead model and not on the agent model. What this does is it allows us to create every lead with its own agent. So we could have thousands of leads in the database, and each lead would have its own agent. Whereas if we put the field over here, say we went and said lead equals to models.foreignkey to the lead model, and we said on delete is models.cascade, what this is going to do is it's going to say that every agent can only have one lead. And so if we had thousands of leads, then we wouldn't have enough agents. So this would just be completely wrong. It would be going from the other way around. And so we need to specify it like this. We need to say that every lead has an agent. So hopefully this structure makes sense. But it's very important to understand this models of foreign key because it allows us not only to create the relationship, but to do some very cool things later on where we can filter for all the leads for a particular agent. And we can do nice complex queries thanks to this relationship. And still, this is only the beginning of these kinds of relationships. You can do way more complicated things, but the foreign key is definitely one of the fields that you're going to use the most when you are creating relationships. Now, before we make the migrations for this model, what I want to introduce you to is the built-in user model provided by Django. And this is also something very important because you're going to use it for authentication and for just referencing, and because a lot of the time you'll want your database to be related to the users, right? So maybe users are logging into the website, they're creating different things. In our case, they're creating leads. And so they're tied to the user that actually creates them. That's just as an example. But a lot of the time, users are, unless your site doesn't use users, users are incredibly important. And Django has a lot of built-in functionality to handle authentication. And one of those things is the user model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say from django.contrib.auth import the get user model. Now this get user model is a function that you can use to essentially grab the user model provided by Django. So what you would do is you would say user equals get user model, like that. And this user is then something that you can actually use in your foreign keys. So we could say, for example, that the agent is essentially a user. So we can say that this is a foreign key to the user model, and we just reference it there, user, and we can say on delete. So on delete being when the user is deleted, what's going to happen to the agent. And we're going to go with the same thing. We're going to say models.cascade. So if a user is deleted, then that user's agent is deleted as well. Now, the foreign key is actually not the best option to go with in this case, because the foreign key allows us to create many agents for one user. What we want to do is we want to create one agent for every one user. So basically a user can only have one agent associated to it. And what this is called is a one-to-one field, which is this here. And it works exactly the same way as how we wrote the foreign key. It's got to be linked to another model, which in this case is the user model. And it's got to specify on delete, which is models.cascade. So what this means is that every agent has one user. Now, authentication is quite a big section on its own, and we could talk about that a lot. But the most important thing that you need to take away from this entire section is that you most likely should create your own user model. And that is because, one, it's recommended in the Django documentation that eventually you're going to want to customize, or you might have to customize your user model. And if you're using the built-in model provided by Django, it's going to provide a lot of headache later down the line if your project gets a lot bigger and you already have existing users. So it's really highly recommended that you have your own custom user created from the start that you can then use in your project. And it's really easy to set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create our class user, and I'm going to get rid of our user and get user model import there. And what we're going to do is we're going to import something from .auth.models. So if we say import, then there's a couple things we can import. What we want to import is the abstract user. And we can actually take a look at this class. And so if you go to, if I just close this, go back to our models.py. So if you right click and say go to definition, then what it will do is it will open up that file. Sometimes it takes a while, but inside your env folder, you can just go into, if we scroll up here, the library folder / in my case 3.7 side packages, Django, into the contrib folder, auth, and then inside auth you can go to models.py, which is the file that I have open here. And this is on line 315, right? So this is a whole bunch of stuff inside Django. And if we just scroll down back here to abstract user, then you can see this is the actual user model created by Django. And it says it's an abstract base class implementing a fully featured user model with admin compliant permissions. Username and password are required. Other fields are optional. So you can see the fields here, right? There's the username, which is a character field. And we can see that it's unique. We can see that it has a maximum length of 150 characters, so we can't go anything longer than that. It's got some special validators. Validators is another argument that you can pass into the character field, and we're giving it this username validator, which basically just checks that there's no funny characters that are being passed into the username. And there are unique error messages as well, so a user has that, or a user with that username already exists. And then there's a bunch of other fields here as well. First name, last name, email, which is an email field. The is staff field, which is a Boolean field, so that's either true or false. Is active, which determines whether a user is active and can log into the system. So if a user is inactive, then they won't be able to log in. The date joined, which is the user that the date that the user signed up. And then we have some extra stuff over here, which we're not going to get into, but those are all the fields on the model that make up what a typical user model would look like in terms of a web application. And so what we're doing is we are inheriting from this abstract user. So if we don't inherit from it and we don't create our own custom user, then Django is going to use this as the default user. And of course, this is in the source code. So if you need to make any changes, it's going to be a little bit of a problem. So let me just close this and come back to our models.py. And again, we're importing the abstract user here. And so we're going to take that and we're going to make our user model inherit from the abstract user. So what this means is now we have all those fields. We have first name, last name, email, is active, staff, all of that. That's all going to exist on our own user model. And all we're going to do is just type pass. So that means that nothing else needs to be added here. It just allows us to create the shell, our own class. So this will just allow us to specify essentially nothing. We're not adding anything new. We're just inheriting from it and creating our own user. And this is super important because let's say that a year from now we have a whole bunch of users on the site and we want to add our own custom field on our user model. Say it's a cell phone number. Well, then we can just come over here and we can create the cell phone number field, and we can create, let's say, a character field with maximum length of 15 characters, and we'll make the migration and migrate, and that will be it. We've now very simply just changed our user model. So it's very important that we make this very important change in the beginning to set this up. But there's one last thing that we need to do, which is to go into the settings.py file and basically configure to tell Django that we have our own custom user model. And the way that we do that, I'm just going to do it here at the bottom, is by saying auth user model. And this is a path firstly to the name of the app, which is going to be leads. And then Django will automatically look inside the models.py file. So we are just going to say leads.user. So we can go and close that. And now that we have our own custom user model specified inside our models.py, we can specify the user related to the agent inside here, which we're doing over there. And we don't need to pass the first name and last name because we already have that on the abstract user. The lead, we're not going to associate with the user because the lead is more of a record of personal information and who we need to get in contact with. It doesn't necessarily mean that the lead is going to actually log into the system. So we're going to keep first name and last name here, but we don't need it on the agent because the agent is going to log into the system. If it doesn't make sense right now, that's okay. Later on, when we see how agents will log into the CRM, it'll make a little bit more sense. But so now you know how to create your own custom user model. And this is not the only way to do it. There are much more in-depth tutorials that show you how you can use another class that you can inherit from this same file that allows you to create your own custom user from scratch. But I would recommend for absolute beginners that you just go with this method because it's a lot simpler and you don't need to customize as much code to get started. So like that. Now what I'm going to do is delete the database because we'd already started with our default model in the beginning when we ran that migrate command. So I'm going to delete the db-sqli3 file. I'm going to bring up the terminal, stop the server there, and I'm going to run manage.py, make migrations. The reason why I'm doing this is because we have our own custom user here. So I'm going to go into the leads app, into migrations, and I'm going to delete this 0001 initial as well. All right. So let's come back here, run migrations or make migrations. And now we can see that there are three models created: create model user, create model agent, create model lead, all in the same file. And if we take a look at the migration file that was created, then here we can see when it was generated, and there's quite a lot of other imports that were added here. So all of those are there. And now we have the migration class, and before we look at operations, we now have this list here called dependencies. And dependencies is basically a list of other migration files that need to be executed before this migration file. In this case, it's saying that this migration file, 0001, must be applied after this migration file, 0012, alter user first name max length. Right, so this one, which is a built-in or a default migration provided by Django will be executed before this one. And then if we take a look at the operations, then we can see create model called user, and we get all the fields that were added here. So these are all of the provided fields by Django. And then we have the agent model, which has, again, an ID used as the primary key. And we have the user, which is a one-to-one field with the user model. And you can see here that it's saying one-to-one field. There's the onDelete keyword. And then there's this keyword here, which is to, and it's being set equal to settings.authUserModel. And this settings.authUserModel is the setting that we set in the Django settings file. And then lastly, we have the lead model, which again has a primary key, first name, last name, age, and then the agent being a foreign key to, and you can see here, leads.agent, which is going to be this model here. So that is our migration file. And now what we can do is run migrate. So we run that, and now you can see, if I just bring this up here, that we get all of these migrations, and right here is auth 0012 alter user first name max length. Remember, that's the dependency for this file here, dependencies there. And right after that, right after 0012, we see leads 001 initial. So this migration file, leads 0001, was executed right after its dependency. And then we have admin and the rest of the Django migrations. So if we just clear this and bring up the database over here, so let's just close that, SQLite Explorer, and I'm going to refresh that just in case. And now we can see here that we have all the Django tables, and we have leads underscore agent for the agent model, leads underscore lead for the lead model. And you can see there's an agent ID table, or column rather, and it's an integer, and it's not null as well. And then we get leads underscore user, which has a whole bunch of columns here. And you get another one, which is leads underscore user underscore groups. And this is just something that comes part of the way the authentication works. We're not going to go too much into it, but it is another model created by Django, which is groups, and then user permissions as well. So most important are the three tables that we created ourselves. So like that, we now have our, let's just bring this up here. We now have our models created. We've created the migrations, got the new file there, and so we can use this setup going forward. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about another concept in Django's models, which are model managers. Now here I have an example of a car model, and you can see we've got three fields on it, which is the make, and we've made that a character field with some choices being the car manufacturers. So we can choose between Audi, BMW, and Ferrari. And then we have the model, which is just a character field where we could enter anything. And then we have the year, which is an integer field, and the default is set to 2015. Now, when we inherit from Django's model, we are inheriting a bunch of features that we can't see. They're built into the Python model class. And one of them is this manager, which is what we're going to take a look at. So to access the car manager, we use this dot notation where we call the class name, so in this case car, and then dot objects. And that dot objects is calling the model manager. So we're accessing the model manager by calling dot objects. And on the manager, we get access to a whole bunch of methods that allow us to query the database and perform actions on the database. So as an example, we can create a new car by saying car.objects, right, using the manager, and saying .create. So the create method is one of the methods that comes with the model manager. And in this case, it has to do with the car model. So when we want to create a new car in the database, we need to pass in all the fields that are required for that model, which is the make. So we see make equals BMW. The model is, in this case, we set it to the X5, and we've set the year to 2017. And what that'll do is it will create a new car in our database. So it's going to populate a new row in the car table, which is going to have all that information, BMW X5 and 2017. Now, this is just one example of the methods that's provided on the model manager. And again, this comes with Django by default. This is what Django provides us. But it's not the only thing that we can do. So we can also create these queries. And this is where the concept of a query set comes in. So using the manager, we can query the database. And if you look at the first example, we can see that we are calling car.objects.all. And what that does is it queries the database for all of the cars. So the syntax is nice and simple there. You're calling .objects.all for all of the entries in the database. And then we can do even more things like filtering. So we can say query for all the cars with a specific make. So we want to retrieve all the cars that are Audis, and we can just say car.objects.filter, and we pass in how we want to filter it. So we want to filter it by one of the fields on the Django model, which is in this case the make, and we want to query for where the make equals to Audi. And then the last example you can see is where we're querying the year, and here it's a little bit more syntax involved, but it's also relatively simple. We're saying filter where the year double underscore is GT, which stands for greater than 2016. And if you wanted to do less than 2016, it would be LT. And there's a whole bunch of different variations and filters that we can apply. But just to give you an idea, now you can see the .create method, the .all method, the filter method, and there are many other methods that we'll explore throughout the course. And you'll see that these methods allow us to interact with the database in many different ways. And the most important thing to remember here is that whenever we're querying the database, so we are filtering or retrieving a list of rows from the database, the data type is called a query set. So in Django terms, what this means is you've retrieved a query set, and that query set has a whole bunch of properties that allow us to do multiple things on it, like looping through the query set, just like you would loop through a for loop, or you can do other things in templates, and you can do complex queries further on that query set. So it's a much more complicated version of essentially a Python list, if you want to think of it like that. So coming back to our example here in the code with our user, lead, and agent, we can also use the object manager on these models. And we're going to take a look at some queries on the database for these ones in what is called the shell. Now in Python, you also have the Python shell. And if I just bring up a terminal here, what you do is you just type Python, and if you execute that, then you'll see it brings up this shell with 3 arrows pointed like this, which means that you're in the shell, and you can write Python inside and execute it. Now in Django, you can do the same thing by creating a Python shell that basically has access to your Django project, because we have all of these files here with models and other things that we can import, and maybe we just want to play around with them in the shell. So to do that, we just have to use the manage.py file. So we're going to run a new command, and that is python manage.py shell. And like that, you'll see that it creates a shell exactly like the normal Python shell, except now we can do things like importing these models into the shell. So we'll say from leads.models import lead, and you'll see that executes. And now we can play around with this model and run some queries on the database like I just showed you. So using the syntax of .objects, we can do things like .all, and you'll see that when we execute this, we have this output here, which is a query set, and it's got this empty brackets here, which means that it's an empty query set, but the data type of this call returns a query set. And it's very important to understand that in Django, because query sets have a lot of properties, and that allows you to further filter them and do all kinds of complex SQL queries on them. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a lead. But in order to do that, we have this foreign key which is pointing to the agent model, and the agent is pointing to the user. Now you might be wondering, well, where does the user come in? Well, normally the user would be created when they sign up and they create an account, or we can create our own users manually in the Python shell like we're doing now. But in order to just do it a little bit quicker, what I'm going to do is make use of another Django command. First, I'll just exit out of the shell, and I'm going to run Python, and I'll just close that, manage.py create superuser. And this create superuser command will essentially create an admin user, and we'll be able to see what that user can do in a second. But for now, what I want to do is just use it as our first user in the database that we can then work with to create an agent. So let's go and run this, and it asks us for a username, which I'm just going to go and enter a username, and we can put our email address, and we can do a password and confirm the password. And in my case it's too common, but that's fine. I'm just going to create the user anyway, and then we can see super user created successfully. So now if we go and bring up the shell again, then I'm going to import our user model, but I'm not going to import it from this file. I'm going to import it the correct way, which is through Django's settings. So what I'm going to do is say from django.contrib.auth import get user model, and we're going to assign user equal to get user model like this. So now we have the user, and this is actually the exact same model as this user class here. It's just a more correct way of referencing the user. So now that we have that, we can call the .objects on the user model, because this is a model just like every other model, and we can see how many users we have. So we can just say .all, and now you can see that we have the query set, and inside this query set we have a user model being printed out, and the username in this case is Matt. So this shows us that we have one user in the database. And if I were to just bring up the SQLite Explorer for a second, and we go to the leads and then user, I'm going to say show table, and if I just try and close some of this, then let's just bring this over. And here you can see we have one entry in the database, or in this table, we have an ID, which is the auto created field, and it's number 1. So it starts, this is user number 1. The password with the hashed password value stored there. The last login is null because I haven't logged in yet. You'll see is super user, and this is a Boolean field, and it's set to 1, which means that it's true. We then have the username, which we set as Matt, the email address, and is staff, which is also set to true, is active is set to true, and we have the date joined, which has today's date. So you can see that the user is in the database, and if we just bring up the terminal again, we can see it in this query set. So now that we have a user, we can import our agent model and create our first agent. So what I'll do is say from the leads app .models import the agent, and then we can call agent.objects, grabbing the object manager, and we say .create. Now inside this create method, we need to pass in all of the fields that our model has. So in this case, the agent model only has one field, which is the user field, and we're going to assign the user being our admin user. So in fact, before we call the create, what I'm going to do is grab the user by saying that our user, let's say that it's admin user, and I'm just going to clear that, equals to user.objects.get, and this is a new method that we haven't looked at yet, .get. So this is going to retrieve one instance, one specific row in the database, and I'm going to say where the username, which is a field on the user model, equals to Matt, like that. And now you can see that did execute. And if I were to print out the admin user, then there we can see there's that user. And understand that this is no longer a query set, because the .get is not retrieving multiple instances in the database. It's only retrieving one instance. So you will always end up with the data type of the model you're working with, which in this case is the user model. So now that we have the admin user, we can go and create the agent. So let's go and say that our agent equals to agent.objects.create, and we're going to pass in the user equal to the admin user that we just created now. So if we do that, now we can see we have an agent. Let's print it out, and we see agent. Now notice here that the sort of output looks a little bit different. We see agent, which is the data type of the model, and now we see this kind of string representation, which is agent object number 1. And the way that you change that, the way that it outputs this little label here, is by coming to the model and defining a very special method on the model, which is the double_string method. And that just takes in self. And this will basically return the string representation of the model. So in this case, there is no string representation. So it's just saying agent object. But we can be a little bit more descriptive, and we can say return self.user, which is the user model. And I'm just going to say return their email, for example. And remember, .email is a field on the user model. So like that. Now, in order to have that take effect, we're going to need to exit out of the shell, and we'll just create another shell. And then we will say from leads.models import the agent, and we'll say agent.objects.all. And now you can see that the output has changed. We have the agent model, the data type, and then the string representation is the email of the user in this case. So that is how we can use the object manager or the model manager to interact with the Django database. And this way of interacting with the database in Python syntax is called using an ORM. So Django has a built-in ORM, which stands for Object Relational Mapper, and that lets us work with Python objects as representations of the database. So we get to use this nice syntax of querying the database without having to write SQL queries raw. Now, lastly, we're just going to go and create our lead, because that's what we were aiming to do. So let's go and import the lead model. So we'll say leads.models import lead, and we will say lead.objects.create. And here we need to pass in a couple parameters. So the first one is the first name, and let's say that this is Joe Soap. We'll say the last name, or actually not Joe Soap, but just Joe, and last name is Soap. The age, let's say he's 35, and we'll say the agent is going to be this first agent here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy all of this without executing it and just get rid of that. And we just need to grab our agent first. So what I'm going to do is say that the mat agent, for example, equals to agent.objects.get, and I'm going to say where the user double underscore, and this might seem a little bit strange, but basically what this lets us do is query the agent table based on the user model, and the double underscores lets us filter by the fields on the user. So I can say where the user email equals to matt@justdjango.com, and you can see that that worked perfectly fine. We have the Matt agent here, and notice the data type. I still have an agent model, which is the data type here, but I retrieved it from the database using the user table. So I did a little bit more of an advanced lookup to retrieve it. And so now that we have the agent, I'm just going to bring back this call here, which is to create the lead, and I'm going to set the agent equal to the agent that we just fetched from the database. So if we execute that, then now we can see lead.objects.create was outputting this here, which is lead object number 1. Same thing as before with what we saw in the agent model. We can just add a string method here to the lead model, and we'll say return first name, and we can maybe do a little Python F string, and then we'll do self dot last name like that. Right, so that allows us to output a string, and we're just putting in these variables into the string. So in order to have that take effect, we're going to exit out, go back into the shell, and we can say from leads.models import lead, and we'll say lead.objects.all, and now we can see there is the first lead, and we're outputting out the first and last name there. So now that we understand models and query sets, what we're going to do is take a look at the Django admin. Now, in order to do this, we're going to need to run the server. So I'm going to do manage.py, run the server, and there we go. And then we can just go into the browser and go to our local host, and we're going to go to /admin. Now you'll see that this brings up a little form here asking us for our username and password. And because we created a super user, we now actually have a user that can log into this Django admin. So super users and staff users are able to log into this little portal, and this is something that is provided by Django by default, so we didn't have to code any of this. This is just thanks to Django. And so we'll log in. I have my username and into the password, log in, and here we can see a little welcome screen with the site administration, and we can see a little category here which is authentication and authorization. But we're going to add all of our models to be displayed here in the admin so that we can work with them. And it's very, very handy because we can do all kinds of filtering. We can create new entries, update them, and just retrieve them and look at the information from inside this little dashboard. So it's very convenient. So in order to do this, we're going to go into the code, and we're going to open up the admin.py file inside the Leads app, and we're going to import our models in here. So we're going to say from.models import, and we created a user model, we created a lead and an agent. And in order to essentially register them in the admin, we call this admin import, so the from Django.contrib admin, we call admin.site.register, and we pass in the model we want to register. So let's pass in user, and if we go back and refresh the page, you can see that we have a whole new section here which is under leads, and that's the name of the app, leads. And inside this app we have a users section which is for the user model. Now let's go and register the other ones here as well. So this one's going to be lead and agent, and if we come back and refresh here, now we can see agents, leads, and users. Let's go to users first, and you'll see that it takes us now to a very simple layout with all of the users in our database. So here's the user, and there's the string representation, which is coming from the abstract user. But if we were to go and take a look at the leads, you can see there's Joe Soap, and go to agents, there's the agent. And these little labels here are exactly what's coming from the string methods here. So if you were to change this to be, let's say, username for the agent, and we went back and refreshed here, you would see now that it shows Matt instead of the email. So it's up to you for how you want to display it, but the point is that the string method is helpful for representing the model as a string. So there's our agent, and if we click on it, it takes us to that model. Now we can see all of the fields on this model, and this one only has one, which is the user. And you see here that there's a little drop down which lets us select the user that this agent belongs to. So if we go to leads and we click on Joe Soap, then we can see a little bit more detail that we have the first name, the last name, the age, and we can update these values here. So if we were to change this to Dave and save that, now we have Dave Soap. So you can change all of this information here we can select the agent that this belongs to, and we can also delete it. If we wanted to delete this, we can delete it, and we say, yes, I'm sure. And we can go and create another lead as well. So we can go and add them back and select the agent, click save, and there's our new agent, or our new lead rather. And so that is the Django admin. It's very convenient because every time you create a new model, you just come and register it here, and it lets you really just play with it very immediately, very quickly, without having to set up your own little dashboard with basic functionality. You can just come here and immediately start managing the data. Now, this is more of an admin backend, so you wouldn't want your users to be logging in here. You'd rather just build your own little front end for users to log into and deal with the data there. But for staff users and admin users, then this might be fine to work in. So now we're going to get started with views. And views are one of the most important parts of Django because it's all about handling web requests and sending responses. So we're going to start in the leads app, and we're going to go into the views.py file. And you can see that there's already an import here from Django, which is this render from Django's shortcuts. Now, to create a view, we're going to start with function-based views, which means that we use Python functions to act as the way to handle the view. And so the way that we do that is just firstly define the function. So let's say that this is going to be our home page, right? And this is a normal function, which means that it takes in parameters. And in Django's case, a function needs to take in the request. Now, this request is one of the parameters, and Django will provide the request to our function every time someone goes to a specific page on our website. And we can access information from this request, such as the logged in user. We can look at things like the IP address of the request, the user agent, so what device is the user requesting on. We can see what type of browser it is, all that kind of information in the request. But what we're going to start off with is just returning a simple HTTP response. And the way that we do that is by importing this from Django. So we're going to say from django.http, which is another module in Django, and we're going to import the HTTP response. Now, this HTTP response is what we're going to use to return to the request. So we're going to say return HTTP response, and we're just going to say hello world in typical fashion. So when someone makes a request, we're just going to return them this. Now, in order to actually use this function, we need to add this to our URLs. And I'm going to go into our DJCRM folder into the urls.py file. And first, I'm just going to delete this big comment here so that we can only focus on this. And you'll see that the URL patterns is a list of paths. And basically what this does is it manages the paths of our web application, and it tells Django which view to handle that path. So in this case, we started off, Django provided us with the admin path, and what that does is whenever we go to /admin, then these URLs will handle that request. But what we want to do is just a little bit simpler. So we're going to create our own path here, and we're just going to leave it empty, which means if we go to basically the root of our web application, just / like that, then we're going to use our view to handle this request. So we're going to say from the leads app.views import the home page. That was the name of the function, and we just pass it in here as the second parameter. So there's a couple things here that I'll review. Firstly, if we open up the views.py, we have a function, and this function takes in a request. We are returning an HTTP response, and we're just saying hello world. And this function we need to tell Django to use, so we're going to use it every time someone navigates to this path of the web application. So the first argument of the path is the actual path in the browser that they would navigate to, and this is the function that will handle the request. So you can imagine that Django will take our function, it'll pass the request into the function, so that request, and we just are expected to return a response to that. So let's make sure that the server is running and we have it running there. Let's come back here and let's go to the root path and we can see hello world. All right, so that was the HTTP response that we got back from the server. And that is basically a view in Django. Now, obviously things can get a little bit more complicated, but in its purest form, this is what a view is. So we are in the browser, going to a web address, navigating to some path, we hit enter, and this makes a request to the server, which is the Django server, and Django will then look inside the urls.py, and it's going to go through each of these paths one by one. So if we had a whole list of them, it's going to start at the top, and it's going to go through them each one by one until it finds one that matches the path that we requested. So in this case, because we went to the empty path, Django sees that, okay, it matched this path, and it will stop there and return the function here to handle the request, which in this case, all it does is just return a simple response that says hello world. So now that we have our first view working, you might be wondering, well, how do we send back HTML pages? So we might have some very detailed HTML page with CSS and all these other things that we want to display. So how do we send that back instead of our very simple example of hello world? Well, the render command that's imported here actually does just that. So what we can do is, instead of returning this HTTP response, is we can return a render call, and underneath the hood it is doing the exact same thing. It's returning an HTTP response, but all we need to do is just tell Django which HTML template we want to send back. So I'm going to show you how you can add templates into the Django project, and there's two conventions of how you should do this. The first one is by creating a folder inside your app called templates. Now, inside the templates folder, you're going to create another folder, and we're going to call that leads, which is the name of the app. Now, the reason we do this is because Django will by default look inside every app, inside templates, and then inside that app. So Django automatically is configured to look for this folder. So if you add templates inside here, so if we create a file, let's call it our homepage.html, then this will be picked up by Django. We don't need to add anything into our settings. This is perfectly fine. So I'm going to go and add an HTML5 boilerplate to this, and I'm just going to say, here's an H1, we'll say hello world, and we'll say here's our custom HTML template, and then we can go into our views.py, and we're going to render the request using this HTML page. So first we need to tell Django about the request. So we need to pass the request into this render function. And the second argument to the render function is the name of the template that we want to pass in. So in this case, it's going to be leads, which is the name of the folder, slash, and then it's going to be homepage.html. And like that, we will then basically have Django return an HTTP response, and it's going to use this template as the response on what to actually return. So our server is running, and if we come back here and refresh this, and we can see hello world, here is our custom HTML template. So that is the first way that we can add templates, by going inside the app. And there's another way which is very common, and I tend to like it as well, which is by adding a templates folder into the root of your project. So let's go and do that. Templates, just like that. And now this is not discovered by default, so we need to tell Django about this folder. So inside DJCRM, we need to go into our settings.py, and we're going to come up here to the templates settings, right, which is this list of configurations. And if you remember earlier on, I mentioned that DIRs is a very important part of the template settings. So DIRs, which is the directories, is a list of directories. And so what we want to do is we want to add our templates directory into this list of directories for Django to know about. And so if we take a look here all the way at the top, we have this from pathlib import path, and we have the base directory being set as essentially the getting this, in my case, getting started with Django folder, which is what is the root of the project. It holds everything inside of it. So that is the base directory. And all we need to do is just add the /templates to that path, and that will be the